Freddy vs. Jason, the novelization by Stephan. Chapter 17. It was a beautiful sunny day, beautiful sky, beautiful trees, and the lake. The water was calm and clear, the wooded hills and blue sky above meeting their reflection on the surface of the lake with sharp, inverse symmetry. The mirror illusion was so clear it gave Lori a feeling of vertigo. She felt that if she stepped out onto the lake, she would find herself falling up through the sky. But this was a great place to be, so peaceful. This was a place to relax, not get caught up in irrational fears. Smell the clean air, listen to the wind rustling through the leaves. Feel the solidity of the place. The lakeside was heaven on earth, and not all what she'd expected to find. Not at all the kind of place where, shh! The lake was just ahead, and to the right of Lori as she walked along a road that was little more than a dirt track. Even the sandy soil looked appealing beneath golden sunlight. Birdsong? Wow, this was wonderful. Lori had always seen herself as a city person. She didn't think that the beauty and tranquility of nature could get under her skin like this. She almost felt as if she'd come home. The road led to a sign, 2 carved totem poles, one each side of the road, holding a large panel of wood, cut in the shape of eagle's wings, and crowned by a painting of Native American chief in feathered headdress. Below the portrait of the chief were 3 words made from what looked like bits of tree branch lashed together to form letters. Camp Crystal Lake. An additional legend in white paint said, "Welcome kids ages 8 to 12. So this was it, Camp Crystal Lake. Lori paused for a moment to look up at the sign. Then she took a deep breath and walked under it and headed along the dirt road towards the camp. The camp itself was little more than a handful of cabins, built next to a narrow wooden pier that ran out onto the lake. The cabins were mostly painted green, but some were furnished with notice boards and old-fashioned electric lights. Walking closer now, Lori could see some canoes lying near the water's edge, and there was a tall lifeguard's chair with a first aid kit and some bright orange life jackets, and there were some green wooden seats for lounging on. A tall white flagpole stood in an open square at the very center of the camp. Lori smiled. The stars and stripes, still a reassuring sight even in these cynical times. Near the flagpole stood some replica teepees and a tall wooden statue of a brown bear. Lori liked the feel of the place. It was all about nature and about history. And it was fun, the kind of place Lori would have liked when she was a child, even if the camp seemed a little old-fashioned. A black 1940s Chevrolet pickup was parked alongside the camp recreation hall, and the camp counselors she could see talking on the veranda of the hall looked like they'd just escaped off the set of Happy Days or something like that. There were 2 gals and 2 guys talking and laughing in what looked like museum regulation navy blue shorts and starched white t-shirts with stiff round necks. And their hairstyles, they were the kind of cuts Lori had seen in her family photo album, black and white, pictures of her parents, aunts, uncles, when they'd been children. She didn't get it. She knew Crystal Lake was a bit out of the way, but she didn't expect it to be so locked down on the whole Elvis thing. She could see some of the kids now. They were all dressed in the same white shirt and dark blue shorts as the counselors, not forgetting their choice of either white or blue ankle socks. The kids were playing a game. There were around 20 of them, and they were all running and shouting, "Freak show! Freak show!" Freak what? Lori could see now that the kids were all running and shouting because they were chasing someone, a small boy at the front of the pack. Not only that, but they were pushing and shoving him and taunting. "Freak show! Freak show!" What kind of sick game was this? The kids caught up with their victim and formed a circle around him. The boy couldn't be much more than 10, 11 years old. Lori couldn't quite see him in the middle of the crowd, but she could hear him running, his shoes scuffing the dirt as he lurched this way and that, to break out of the ring tightening in around him. Lori moved closer to see just what the hell was going on. It all looked a little too serious for her liking. This wasn't a game. The kids were being cruel. As she drew near, she saw a girl put a cloth sack over the trapped boy's head. "Cover that ugly face, Jason," she teased. The boy, Jason, stumbled around blinded by the bag over his head. Another boy pushed him to the ground. "Monster!" he shouted. Laurie couldn't believe it. They were all young boys and girls, all sons and daughters of someone somewhere. Bright young things, clean-cut boys, cute kids. One day they would grow up to be lawyers, doctors. These brats were the future of America, and here they were, tormenting a kid just because of the way he looked. Outraged, Laurie walked over to the teen counselors who stood talking outside the recreation hall. There were two couples, touching, flirting. They weren't paying any attention to what was going on among the kids. "Hey!" Laurie shouted. "Shouldn't you be doing something?" They ignored her completely. "Why don't you help him?" she called again. No response. They just kept on gazing into each other's eyes and smiling. Laurie could hear the kids beating on Jason, could hear him yelping with pain and fear. But nothing could prepare her for the shock of what she saw when she walked up onto the porch of the recreation hall. One of the pairs of counselors were actually having sex. They were standing, the girl with her back to the wall, the guy up in front of her thrusting, both their shorts around their ankles. The guy had his back to Laurie. He was too busy humping his gal senseless to notice Laurie's presence at all. She couldn't believe it. It was the middle of the day in the open. The kids could see them, and they were screwing. What kind of place was Camp Crystal Lake? Laurie grabbed the grunting counselor from behind. "Beat it! Can't you see I'm busy?" he chided, not even bothering to turn around to look at her, not missing a beat in his humping. Sheer disbelief wavered through Laurie's voice. "You're not coming?" Now the camp counselor paused in his labors. He turned around to face Laurie, the word camp counselor printed on his clean white shirt. But his head and shoulders were the bald, burned raw visage of Freddy Krueger. And the girl pinned by Krueger's dick to the wall, she was pallid, blue in the face. Freddy Krueger was screwing a corpse. "It's not my fault that this bitch is dead on her feet!" Laurie fell back horrified, her mind spiraling away from her. Now she was beginning to understand. Just then, little Jason broke free of the mob of cruel little bastards and ran crying towards the lake. He ripped the cloth sack off his head, and now Laurie could see that his head was huge, pale, bald, and deformed. "Run, you little baby, run!" screamed the kids. The boy tore off down the long floating pier that led out over the lake. His tear-streaked face was a picture of unbearable anguish. The van was going full speed now. Kia checked her watch. "It's been 2 minutes," she said with a look of determination in her eyes. Linderman responded by slamming another injection into the decaying skin of Jason's neck. "That's the last of the trank," he declared. "We're out." Laurie still lay beside Jason, rocking on the floor of the van. Her eyes were twitching. She was dreaming. Both Laurie and Jason were dreaming. And in the world of dreams, Freddy Krueger held all the bloody aces in the fingers of his razor-gloved hand. As soon as Laurie heard the splash, she raced to the end of the dock. She didn't know if the boy had slipped or if he jumped, and right now she didn't care. She had a boy's life to save. "Hang on!" she shouted as she knelt down on the wooden floor and leant forward to reach into the water. She could see his hand, thrashing, fighting for life in the water. It was just inches away, just a bit further, a bit more. There! Laurie braced herself, then pulled hard, lifting Jason up out of the water. Jason. His pale, ugly white face, his uneven, bulbous, insipid eyes, his lifeless lips, his ugly, distorted, squat features, his repellent corpse mass of a head, alive and yet abhorrent in the eyes of nature. A thing, a satanic, genetic deviant who should never have been born. Jason, the mutant boy, who would one day become Jason, the brutal killing machine. Despite herself, and despite the fear in Jason's eyes and his need for help, Laurie let go of him. The shock of seeing Jason had been too much for her. Water splashed over Lori's flared jeans as Jason tried to swim to the surface. But he couldn't, and his head was soon below the surface of the lake again. Lori shook her head. She couldn't believe what she'd just done. Was she any different than the kids who'd put the bag over Jason's head? Quickly, she extended her open hand down into the water. She could see him. He was flailing, drowning. No! She was losing him. He was sinking, dying, and it had all been her fault. If she could save Jason, then maybe the whole nightmare at Crystal Lake would never happen. He wouldn't have to drown, so his mother wouldn't need to avenge herself against the camp counselors. The whole bloody cycle of violence and vengeance that had blighted Crystal Lake for almost 50 years need never start. Lori reached down, leaning as far into the water as she could, and grabbed him. Up, up, up. He strove, helped by Lori, to... Water showered all over Lori, as if a depth charge had just exploded. But it was Krueger launching himself up from deep within the lake, so that he could grab hold of Jason's head and force the little retarded bastard back down into the water where he fucking belonged. Freddy howled with glee. Lori's grip was broken in an instant, and soon Krueger had his fingers wrapped around the boy's throat, strangling Jason while dunking his ugly fucking head into the water. Again and again and again. The boy's hand flailed. "No!" screamed Lori. She didn't know how Freddy was able to stand or float in the water like that, but she understood the deal. She knew that the only law of physics in the nightmare realm was that Freddy Krueger could do whatever the fuck he liked. "Oh, to be young and drowning again!" panted Freddy, his face growing cold and emotionless as he held Jason's head steady under the water. Bubbles broke the surface of the lake. Jason's last breath. Lori could just hear Jason's voice. He was gurgling in terror. "Damn you, Krueger!" She was powerless. And now Krueger had Jason where he wanted him. He had gone into Jason's mind, found Jason's fear. And now Jason was weak, afraid, insecure. Freddy could kill him. Freddy could kill Jason Voorhees in his childhood nightmare, thereby killing Voorhees in the real world. There would be no more Friday the 13th around Crystal Lake ever again. Something's wrong," warned Kia. She had seen Jason's massive chest heave, his back arching high above the floor of the van, and there was a gasping sound coming through the air holes of his beat-up hockey mask. "He's choking!" Kia scurried away to the front of the van. Linderman was about to join her when he saw something incredible. Water coming up through the holes in the mask. And it wasn't just a trickle. There was a whole flood of water pushing up through the gaps. "He's drowning," said Linderman, his voice spiked with incredulity. "Freddy's killing him." "Well, do something," called Will from the front of the van. "We need him alive." And they did. If Jason died, Lori's plan would be useless. And if he died while Lori was still asleep, what would happen to her? Will guessed it would be impossible for Lori and Jason to somehow share the same nightmare. But if Krueger finished off Voorhees, it would only be a matter of time before he found Lori. Linderman was still having trouble processing Will's orders. "What are we supposed to do?" He laughed grimly. "Give him mouth-to-mouth." Will let silence do the talking for him. Linderman looked over at Kia. She was already looking at him, their eyes locked. They mouthed the words, "Mouth-to-mouth?" "Hell no," said Kia, shaking her head and waving her arms. No way." "You have to," argued Linderman. "I've had asthma since I was 6. I don't have the lung power." Kia looked down at Jason. Water had now spilled all over his filthy ripped-up jacket, and his body was racked with spasms of asphyxiation. "No way." It's only a nightmare. It's only a nightmare. It's only a nightmare. Lori looked at her watch. 15 minutes. Soon. Soon. Her face was horror-stricken as she watched Freddy continue to force little boy Jason down into the muddy depths of Crystal Lake. It's only a nightmare. It's only a nightmare. No! Lori dived forward and grabbed hold of Jason. She would do everything within her power to save the boy from Freddy's evil plans. Linderman held Stubbs' revolver at the ready, the barrel mere inches away from Jason's head. Kia was trembling. No, delete that. Kia was scared to death and shaking like a dog with its tail on fire, which only showed how big her balls were when she reached down with her well-manicured fingers, touched the bottom of Jason's hockey mask. Linderman gripped the handle of the gun tighter and tighter. Kia tensed, ready. She moved the mask, lifting it ever so slightly up and to the side, exposing the full-on fetid canker of Jason's mouth. Kia almost hurled. Instead, she just whimpered, "You can do it, Kia." Oh yeah, easy for Linderman to be a cheerleader. He wasn't the one who had to. "You can do it." Good job Kia didn't see Linderman cringe when she leant in close to Jason. Oh, hell. She could see the moldy gash of his lips, the stench. She leaned closer, her lips soft, full, young, and tender. That god-awful stank. His whole glistening, withered, pulsating. Oh. Their lips were close, almost touching. One slight jerk of the van and their lips would touch. The sweet, sickly stench of maggot shit. Oh! Suddenly it was Kia who needed oxygen. Her throat. She was choking. "Kia!" shouted Linderman. He had seen Jason's arms spring to life, immediately locking a meat hook of a hand around the girl's slender throat. Her eyes began to bulge and she opened and closed her mouth with an awful ratchet sound, trying desperately to claw some oxygen down into her lungs. Jason sat up, snapping his bonds as if they were made of paper. The ropes and chains just fell away as Jason awoke from a bad dream. Linderman fell back and pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, narrowly missing Will up front, shattering the windshield. Almost immediately the van began to lurch from left to right, rocking Linderman to his knees and flinging Kia in all directions, but always with her throat locked in place by Jason's hand. Jason was now breaking the ties around his legs, never relaxing his hold on Kia for a second. If the van hadn't gone out of control, he would have broken her neck by now. As it was, he'd had to adjust his grip, content to strangle her to death instead. Jason moved with the fury that had rarely been seen. He had been attacked. He had been put to sleep. He had been tricked by the creature who pretended to be Mommy. And he had been forced to reveal his innermost fears. He's a creature without fear, a creature who could not be killed. He had been forced to admit his weakness, and that weakness had been used to hurt him. Hurt him as he had never been hurt before. Jason raged with erratic loathing, his body racked with a vengeful death force. With every atom of unbending evil he could muster, he now set about the overkill of the puny victim gripped in his murderous hands. Will slammed the brakes. Will skidded. The van lurched and spun sideways. Will yanked at the wheel. Jason stumbled, Kia falling to the floor of the van with a loud crack. Linderman tripped, dropped, bumped his head in a glancing blow, then raised his gun to fire. Jason raised his arms and dived, hurling his massive body through the air, ready to crush, kill, and maim the insect with the gun. The van left the road and rolled, sending the passengers tumbling and screaming, all except Jason, who in brute silence was thrown back into the rear double doors of the van, breaking them wide open. Jason suddenly found himself hurled out through the back of the van, frustration tearing through his every psychotic muscle as he rolled down the side of the road, his plastic hockey mask hitting into small rocks and tree trunks, before his spinning form finally came to rest on the yellow-lined tarmac. Further along the road, the van was sliding on its side, scraping, screeching down the two-lane blacktop, sparks ascending into the night sky. Inside the van, 3 teenagers cried out for their lives. Chapter 18. Jason was gone. Freddy waved his hands through the water, slicing the lake in two with his glove. But the drowning retard was gone. He'd had him. Voorhees was dead meat, but... Lori dragged herself away from the water and crawled back onto the dock. She looked at her watch. Almost there. Lori! Freddy stared at her from inside the lake. His eyes narrowed. This bitch! She tried to save Jason. She fought with me, pulled Jason out of the water, given the little brat some air. Enough air to keep him alive long enough for the drink to wear off. Oh, she'd saved him. She'd saved Jason. Freddy darted his head at her and snarled, "You!" And suddenly, every ounce of rage Freddy had ever felt, rage for his years of imprisonment in the abyss, rage for every victim Jason had deprived him of, rage for Jason slipping through his sickly, abattoir hands. Rage! Freddy Krueger clenched his fists, tensed his body, then forced his volcanic fury through every corpuscle and twisted cell of his being. Lori screamed till she thought her lungs would burst. Slowly, before her terrified eyes, Freddy began to distort, to change, his very skin becoming an expression of incendiary wrath. In the space of mere moments, Lori found herself staring into the eyes of something utterly feral. She was already terrified of Krueger, but this transformation, this apotheosis into the embodiment of a hellish dream demon. His eyes had become narrow yellow slits with the dead black dot of a pupil. His ears had become pointed, like those of a devil. His brows had become arched, forming an eye mask of hatred. His lips were black, his teeth jagged and sharp. His whole face had taken on the look of eternal evil. While his skin was now the color of blood, only more pitted, more sunken, more a tangle of veins inside a shadow of psychotic slaughter. He raised his right hand. The glove, the blades were longer, sharper, more curved. Truly now a nightmare of precision steel talons. Darkness fell across the lake. With a cut of his hand, Freddy had killed the day. And as Freddy's rage continued to build, a storm began to rise. In the midnight blackness, all Lori could see were those two yellow eyes, the eyes of snarling hatred, the eyes of death. Krueger flew up and out of the lake as if sprung from the water, and landed right before Lori, who fell back onto the floor of the dock, cringing in terror as Freddy made forward to kill her. If evil could kill by evil alone, she would already have been dead 1,000 times over. Lori was paralyzed in the waves of unbridled animosity that ripped out of the hellishly transformed razor killer. Then she heard a series of beeps. Freddy glanced. The alarm on Lori's wristwatch. 15 minutes? Not giving herself time to think, Lori leapt to her feet and lunged forward, straight into Freddy's chest. He snarled as she threw her arms around him. It was time. "Wake me up!" she shouted. "I've got him! I've got him!" Beep, beep, beep. What was that? There was a gentle hissing sound from the blown engine as the van lay on its side. All else was silence, save for that beeping sound. Will came to, held in place by his seatbelt. It had saved his life. He glanced at himself in the rear view. Some minor cuts, bruising. He'd been damn lucky. Lucky? What? It came back to him now, the gunshot, the crash. Jason! Will looked back. Kia and Linderman were lying on what used to be the inside wall of the van. They were both beginning to wake up. Like Will, they'd been stunned, unconscious, and shaken about. But it didn't look as if they'd had anything serious. Then he saw Stubbs's gun. Will unfastened his belt, then climbed into the back of the van. From where he snatched up the recently fired revolver. It was still warm. More beeping. That little sound again. Outside the van!" Will left Kia and Linderman to come around, and hurried out through the broken rear doors. "Lori!" She was lying on the road, a trickle of blood running down her forehead. Fearing the worst, Will rushed forward to Lori's side. Thank God her head was moving. She was all right. She was still asleep. Will looked at her. "Lori! Wake up! Wake up, Lori!" But she just kept stirring in her sleep, and now she was murmuring something. And where the hell was Jason? They had no time for this. "Lori!" More beeping. It was the alarm on her wristwatch. 15 minutes. Kia and Linderman had climbed out of the wreckage of the van and were now standing next to Will. Will turned off the alarm on Lori's watch. If he couldn't wake her, that stupid annoying thing wouldn't. Where were they? It was dark, goddamn dark, and they seemed to be in the middle of a forest. Just slightly ahead, a dirt trail led off-road to the right. The van burst into flames. "Lori!" shouted Will, instinctively shielding her from the heat of the blast. Kia saw something over by the dirt road. She walked over and, "Look!" she said. Will and Linderman followed her finger as she pointed down to something lying on the ground. Illuminated by the fire from the burning vehicle, they saw an old battered sign. It was broken and covered with moss. They could just see the words on the sign. It read, "Camp Crystal Lake." Guys?" Linderman trembled. "Where's Jason?" He was right. Will cast a quick glance over into the dense woodland. Then he scooped the unconscious Lori into his arms. "Start running," he said. Kia and Linderman didn't move. They were too busy looking for Jason. "Just go!" barked Will. "Go!" Then he hoisted Lori up over his shoulder and struggled as quickly as he could along the old abandoned road that would lead the four of them to the side of Camp Crystal Lake. Beep, beep, beep. It stopped. The alarm had stopped. Lori looked down at her watch in panic. Holy fucking shit! If the alarm had stopped, that would mean that Lori was trapped in the dream world with Freddy Krueger.
"What's wrong, Lori?"
sneered Freddy.
"You know, you're on my time now."
Then he was at her.
This time, the bitch was dead.
Lori ran screaming as the Raggedy Razor Man ran spastically right at her. Her foot caught something. He laughed, slashed at her with his glove. She tripped and fell, and kept on falling into a seemingly infinite blackness. Wham! Lori crashed into the ground. The air punched right out of her lungs, and a bone cracking in her back, one of her ribs. She lay still for a long, long while. Then slowly, painfully, she climbed to her feet. This was the nightmare, the game. She had to keep moving, had to stay alive until she woke up. No! No! She was back in front of 1428 Elm Street, her home. The front door was red, its original color. The roses on the trellis were all dead. It was night. Elm Street was all wrong, and Lori was suddenly wearing a white nightgown. No! She turned to run, and her foot was on the last step at the top of her living room stairs, inside the house. She screamed in sheer blind fear. It was happening. The nightmare on Elm Street. Wake me up! Wake me up! Down below at the foot of her stairs stood her dad, Dr. Campbell. He turned to face her and hurriedly started climbing up toward her. He had a knife in his hand, ready. Lori's comatose form weighed heavily on Will as he ran along the dirt road into camp. But he didn't give it a second's thought. All that mattered was that he carried her to safety, away from Jason. Though free from any such encumbrance, Kia and Linderman found it hard to keep up with Will as he maintained his breakneck pace through the darkness. Finally, they made it through the woodland into the center of camp. Camp? Well, a few run-down cabins held together by moss and cobwebs. Some camp. In the near distance they saw what looked like an old recreation hall. This seemed to be the most sturdy of the buildings. So that was where Will decided they'd rest. It was only when they were halfway across the open camp square that they saw the new construction site. Someone was building on Camp Crystal Lake. A banner affixed to some scaffolding read, "Camp Crystal Lake welcomes you back. Future home of lakeside resorts." They were building a fucking holiday home here. Something new, to bring more people, more victims. Will turned away from the site and continued on his way to the ramshackle hall. What neither Will nor any of his friends knew was just how much trouble the local authorities had had in deciding what to do with Camp Crystal Lake. On paper, it was a fabulous site. Great views, natural scenery, peaceful, remote, diverse wildlife. Crystal Lake had everything. Trouble was, it also had an unkillable maniac. The first time they thought they'd got rid of Voorhees, the people of Crystal Lake demolished most of the camp. The second time they thought he was finished, they renamed the town of Crystal Lake to Forest Green, in a feeble bid to erase the town's bloody past. The third time, or was it the fourth, whatever, when they thought Jason was dead that other time, they realized he was the town's most famous son, and some of the more cynical townsfolk realized there were some tourist bucks to be made by renaming the town back to Crystal Lake. Then they heard he'd gone up coast to New York. Then they were told he had come back to Crystal Lake and had been killed by his own fucking niece. Okay, so there was no logic to this Voorhees thing. He died, he came back, he vanished, he showed up. There were no rules with this lunatic. But in between the attacks there were at least a few years of peace and quiet. It had been thus for a few years now, and so the decision had been made to sell the land to a development conglomerate. That way Crystal Lake got some money. No kids were put in any more danger, so no more guilt trips. And if Jason did come back, well, the people who'd be staying here would be wealthy adults. They'd be able to look after themselves. As the mayor said at the time, "You know, when people just calm down and we put aside all the hysteria and wild speculation, you can deal with the Voorhees problem just like any other problem. Throw money at it and it'll go away." In essence, the authorities in the town of Crystal Lake hadn't got a clue. Lori realized with relief that her father couldn't see her, but only after he'd walked up the carpeted stairs and gone right by her. Somehow Lori knew what was coming, and she didn't want to see it. She saw the knife in her father's hand. She had seen it before in her imagination when Will had told her the revelation that had turned her entire world inside out. She knew where he must be heading. She remembered that Will had told her. She knew that Freddy was somehow in her mind. "Daddy, no!" she cried. "Don't, Daddy! Don't do it!" But he didn't hear her. Dr. Campbell rounded the corner of the landing and strode swiftly in the direction of his bedroom, where Lori knew he would use the knife to stab his wife, her mother, to death. Carefully, Will lowered Lori's unconscious body to the floor. Behind him, Linderman had found a fallen wooden plank and was using it to bar the door of the recreation hall. No one was getting in now unless Linderman wanted them to. The place was a wreck, and it stank of mold and dirt. It looked like no one had been there for years. The hall itself was dilapidated and ramshackle, with rotting camp equipment strewn everywhere. Kia went rummaging through the discarded stuff and came up with a kerosene lamp. Amazingly, it still had some fuel left in it. She pulled a lighter from her pocket and lit the small fabric wick. Let there be light. That's one thing, at least. Kia set the lamp down on the dusty floor next to Lori. Will knelt beside her, watching Lori as she moved in her sleep. Lori wasn't murmuring any more. She was talking quite clearly. "No, no, no!" Will slapped her across the face. He didn't want to hurt her, but if what she'd said was right, she could die in her sleep. Freddy could kill her in her dreams. Whatever the truth, Will needed her, now. He grabbed her shoulders, lifted her back up off the floor, and shook her. "Come on, Lori! Wake up!" Dr. Campbell kicked open the bedroom door. Inside he could see his bed. The sheets were raised in a sort of mound, but the mound was moving, as if someone was thrashing under the covers. Wasting no more time, he raised the knife and stepped forward. Lori ran in after him, powerless to stop him as he pulled back the sheets. "Please, Daddy," she cried. "Don't kill her, please." But when the sheets fell to the bedroom floor, Lori saw that her mother was already under attack. Lori's mom was alone on the bed, her body shaking and thrashing beneath the onslaught of an invisible foe. A cut formed on her body, a deep slash down from right shoulder to left hip, but no one was near. Lori watched in soul-shredding horror as the carve-up unfolded in front of her. Her father still held the knife, but he was nowhere near Lori's mom. He just stood at the foot of the bed, his face showing as much fear and horror as anything Lori could muster. Another terror ripped its way across the agonized body on the bed. Something was killing her, something unseen. Lori's mom was being butchered. Fighting against his own terror, Campbell could take no more of this. He lunged forward and stabbed at the empty air above the twitching body of his wife, and again, and then he slashed side to side, up and down, cutting the air with the carving knife. Yet still his wife was being slaughtered, her blood spilling over the floor and walls, even onto the doctor himself. Campbell stabbed a further time, his eyes filled with tears. "Come out and face me, Freddy!" he bellowed, impotent and heartbroken. "Freddy! You come out and face me now!" Lori stopped dead in her tracks. Freddy! He knew. Her dad knew about Freddy. He had known about Freddy all along. This is what Will saw 4 years ago. Dr. Campbell wasn't attacking his wife. He was trying to save her. When Will saw Campbell lunge forward with the kitchen knife, he'd mistakenly thought Campbell was trying to stab his wife. In reality, Campbell was trying to defend her against Freddy Krueger. Campbell was the only one who knew who the real killer was. And that's why he couldn't say a thing. He couldn't tell people his wife had been killed in her dreams by some ghost. So when Will accused him, the doctor had to deal with Will. And he had to deal with Will quickly, even if that meant locking the boy away, because the doctor had to complete his vital mission. Out of all the people in authority in Springwood, only Campbell knew the truth about Freddy. He had to act fast. He had to talk to Sheriff Williams to persuade Williams of the truth about Fred Krueger. Campbell researched past cases. He quickly discovered that Krueger had attacked people in their dreams before. He'd even attacked the previous owners of Campbell's own home, 1428 Elm Street. As a medical psychologist, Campbell also knew some of the history of Weston Hills, but he didn't have any of the details as to why the hospital had been shut down. But when he managed to lay his hands on some highly confidential case files, files that should long have been destroyed, it all became crystal clear. Freddy had been killing kids at Weston Hills. An intern there, Nancy Thompson, who Campbell couldn't believe had also once lived at his home, had tried to save the kids by prescribing them a controversial drug, a dream suppressant called Hypnosil. Thompson did this with the help of a colleague, Dr. Neil Gordon. But eventually the two of them were overruled and fired by their supervisor, Dr. Elizabeth Sims. However, once the kids were brought back off the Hypnosil regime, they all died. So did Nancy Thompson, Neil Gordon, and Elizabeth Sims. The head of the institution, Dr. Carver, was bankrupted by a whole series of successful lawsuits brought against him by bereaved parents, and Weston Hills was shut down. So it was clear what Campbell had to do. He managed to get Weston Hills reopened and brought back into life as a fully functioning medical facility. Then, with the help of the police, he had anyone who was having the Krueger nightmares assigned to the institution, where they were forcibly treated with Hypnosil. Campbell and Williams had no idea how to kill Krueger, but they knew he was real, and they knew how to contain him. Campbell had done what he'd done to Will and all the other kids, because that was the only way he knew how to save people's lives. It was the only way he knew how to protect Springwood from the evil of Freddy Krueger. One day, Campbell hoped to find a way to kill Krueger. He wanted nothing more to exact revenge on the bastard who had murdered his wife. Ultimately, Campbell hoped to see the day when Weston Hills could be closed for good. All of this had been kept from Lori. She would never understand. But what was now clear to Lori was that her mom had not been killed by Dr. Campbell. Her mom had been killed by... Freddy suddenly appeared on top of Lori's dying mother, his claw raised to slash her wide open and send her to hell. Dr. Campbell couldn't see Krueger. He just kept stabbing the thin air with his knife. Only Lori could see the maniac, and Freddy could see Lori. He turned to look at the horrified girl. His new demonic features were spattered with her mom's blood.
I've always had a thing for the whores who live in this house,
he rapped. Then he plunged his 5 cutting blades deep into Mrs. Campbell's chest, ripping upwards and downwards deep into her lungs, tearing open her heart, gashing her pulsating red viscera into a polyester mattress grave. If Lori hadn't been deafened by her own screams, she would have been deafened by her father's. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 17 and 18 of Freddy vs. Jason, the novelization by Stephan Hand. A couple of my top 5 favorite moments from the film happen in these chapters. The whole Lori being at the summer camp in the dream when Jason is being thrown in the water and everything, and Freddy's one of the counselors.
I can't help it that this bitch is dead on her feet.
Always enjoyed that part, made me laugh. Freddy saying fuck it, getting pissed off when she realizes that Jason's gone out of the dream and woken up, and he like turns into like demonic Freddy and jumps out of the water. Always dug that scene. And of course we get the dream evolving into Lori getting to see how her mom really died, which is odd because you would think Freddy would get off more if she thought her dad really killed her mom. That would, you know, Freddy likes to fuck with people's heads, so it's kind of nice of him to clear that up for her so she could go on to have a loving relationship with her dad when all this is over. I don't know. Maybe he was trying to make her feel like shit for considering her dad had done it. But that part always puzzled me. You know, it'd be funnier if Freddy showed her dad killing her mom in a dream, you know, just to really drive it home. Look at that, your dad did kill your mom. So that part's always confused me, but I do enjoy the scene. It's very trippy. I can imagine that's very terrifying and hard to watch for Lori in that moment. So I guess it was more about Freddy just wanting to, you know, get her with like mental warfare, psychological warfare there, and get her at her most vulnerable as she watches her mom murdered. I've always enjoyed the scene where Linderman and Kia are, you know, getting ready to give mouth-to-mouth to Jason. Oh my god, I can only imagine smelling his breath. Jesus. Always startles me in the movie, no matter how many times I've seen it, when Jason snaps to life, even though I know he's going to do it. Even the first time I watched it, I knew it was coming. So very good on the cinematographers there for that little jump scare. Not the same in the book, but still pretty cool. What I really enjoyed about these chapters was like the extra stuff, like that extra couple pages where it was talking about how over the years the people of Crystal Lake, you know, how it talked about how they changed the name to Forest Green for Part 6 and everything, and then they changed it back. And even the author talking about it's like, was that the 3rd time, the 4th time, the 5th time? Whatever. You know, it was actually written that way. I was like, oh my god, perfect. This guy gets it. You know, so this author is obviously a really big fan of at least the Friday the 13th franchise. But then again, I'm going to get to the stuff he talked about the Freddy franchise in a minute. But that part made me laugh and chuckle. It's like, yeah, this guy's seen this. This guy's seen the Jason movies. He knows how we all feel. It's so many changes. So many times Jason's come back and gone away and come back and gone away. But when we got into Dr. Campbell's little thing there in the dream, where it went from what Lori was seeing to what Dr. Campbell had went through with the whole, you know, reopening Weston Hills and everything. And it talked about how Nancy and those other teens had died in Dream Warriors. And then it said Neil Gordon died. I was like, what? So I guess that means, at least in this guy's vision, Dr. Neil Gordon was killed by Freddy sometime after the events of Dream Warriors. Either that or he just messed up and, you know, got his research wrong. and for some reason thought Neil died in the movie. But I thought that was like, wow, and Neil died too? Jesus, man, come on. And it talks about how, he reopened Weston Hills and put these kids there for the good of the town and, to save their lives. But really, with Will, he was only saving his own ass from jail. Will wasn't being terrorized by Freddy Krueger. It was just that Will would have been able to point fingers at Dr. Campbell and say, hey, he killed his wife, because that's what Will saw. If Dr. Campbell really was innocent, like he was, he could have found some way out of it or something. Especially since he was friends with the sheriff. So I guess he was just worried that Will would keep going around telling people that he would complicate it for him, saying that he killed his wife. But he wasn't protecting Will. It was like, I guess it's like the good of the many outweighs the good of the one. He threw Will in that place so Will would keep his trap shut and not make Dr. Campbell's life more complicated. So that little line there, I was like, I don't know if I fully agree with that, because what he did to Will was not to save Will's life. But anyways, guys, we're inching ever so closer to that final battle, big throwdown between Freddy and Jason, the namesake of the book. And I cannot wait to get there, so I'll be back very soon with more of Freddy vs. Jason by Stephen Hand. Let me know what you think of the book so far, what you thought of tonight's chapters, and I'll see you in Chapter 19, 20, and 21. That's all we got left, guys. 3 more chapters in the epilogue. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
pleasant dreams!
Hi, this is Jeffrey Reddick, creator of Final Destination.
Greetings, Slashaholics. This is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror books, the Bard's Blood horror Shakespeare books.
Hey guys, this is Jason Brooks, Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th Vengeance.
Hey, this is Slasher Pepper.
Hey everybody, it's CJ Graham, Jason, Friday the 13th Part 6.
This is William Pattison, known to Friday the 13th fans as Eric Morris.
Hi, this is Deborah Voorhees from Friday the 13th Part 5.
Hey folks, this is Adam Marcus, director of Jason Goes to Hell and Secret Santa.
Hello, kiddies. This is John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper.
Hi, this is Kane Hodder, better known as Jason from Friday the 13th, Victor Crowley from Hatchet.
And you are listening.
You're listening.
And you're listening.
And you're listening.
I just want to make sure you guys know you're listening.
You are listening.
And you are listening.
And you are lucky enough to be listening.
Okay, boils and ghouls, you are listening.
You are listening
to the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
The 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To 80s Slasher Librarian.
To 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian.
To the 80s Slasher Librarian. Keep listening, or I'll kill you.